Obviously, with Vladimir Putin's brutal and violent decision to violate the fundamental laws of the world and invade Ukraine in the way that he has, a lot of attention has focused there. But the bottom line is, why we do need to prioritize, we also need to be aware of, we live in a robust threat environment. We have got to be paying attention to all of it, and trying to make sure that we're meeting all of those challenges, first of all, because they are all important, and second of all, because they all tend to be interconnected. Certainly in the two theaters that we were talking about today, both China and Russia are factors in the great power competition that we find ourselves in. So we want to make sure that we are addressing those issues. So taking them one at a time, starting with the Africa Command, China is incredibly active in that region, looking to build partnerships. The goal of ultimately, building bases wherever they can. It is incredibly important that we keep an eye on that, maintain our relationships in Africa, and try to deal with that challenge. At the same time, the transnational terrorism threat is still very real throughout the continent. Things have gotten more complicated on the Horn given the conflict in Ethiopia. I've always felt that the partnerships that we built to deal with the challenges in Somalia and the challenges that are presented by AQ in the Arabian Peninsula between Yemen and Somalia, the partnerships that we've built with Kenya and Ethiopia and Rwanda and Uganda and others in the region have really been a great model for how partnerships can help us meet our national security threats so that we don't do it all alone. We have a similar and growing challenge in West Africa, as there are a variety of different transnational terrorist elements there that we need to work with. And in the midst of all that, Russia is aggressively through the Wagner Group providing security in that region that is having a very destabilizing effect. It is not a coincidence that the increased presence of Wagner as a security force has matched up with an increase in the number of coups throughout West Africa. We've got a lot of challenges in Africa, and look forward to hearing from General Townsend about his take on those challenges and answering our questions on that. Central Command also has a lot of challenges. Certainly, we've seen the drawdown in both Afghanistan and Iraq over the course of the last 10 years that has changed that, but the challenges are very real. And I know General McKenzie knows that one of the central questions that this committee will have is what now in Afghanistan? There is still a threat there from al-Qaeda and from ISIS. What is our plan for dealing with that threat now that we have pulled out of Afghanistan? And in the Middle East, we still have the challenges from ISIS, the instability in Syria, the instability in Yemen. I am particularly interested to hear the latest on what Iran is up to and how we are working with partners in the region to contain that threat. And also, I'd be curious to hear, as Russia gets, further and further bogged down in Ukraine, what does that mean for their activity in Syria, where, as we know, they have been very involved going forward. The bottom line is, and my written statement gets into a lot more detail, we could talk about both of these areas of responsibility for a very long time. There was a lot to do. There are a lot of challenges. They are a huge part of our national security posture going forward. And I look forward to hearing more details from all three of our witnesses on how best we should meet those challenges going forward. With that, Mr. Rogers is out ill this morning and ably filling in as Mr. Whitman is the ranking member, and I will yield to him for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I deeply appreciate our witnesses coming to testify before us today, and thanks so much for your service. General Townsend, as was discussed last week, the threats in Africa are multifaceted, and they continue to grow. But spending on AFRICOM comprises only about 0.3% of the entire defense budget, not related to the magnitude of what I believe is the building threat. And it's these meager resources that are now spread even thinner because of the challenges we face before us with Russia and China. And that's not just worldwide, that's specifically there on the African continent. Russia has been entering into a disturbing number of arms sales and basing agreements in African nations. China is using the Belt and Road Initiative to extract African natural resources and gain permanent footholds on the continent. The Chinese have built an overseas military base in the strategically important area of the Horn of Africa, and they're actively scouting other locations, including the Atlantic coast. Make no mistake about their intentions. The growing presence of China and Russia in Africa is a threat to our national security, and it's imperative that we increase investments there as well as other places around the world. I look forward to hearing from you, General Townsend, about how we can maximize diplomatic and military efforts to counter Russia and China's growing global ambitions in China. In CENTCOM, General McKenzie, we're also seeing increased Chinese presence. China's building ports and other infrastructure throughout the region, and it's entered into trade and telecom agreements with allies in the region. But what I find most concerning is that President Xi continues to cozy up to the Ayatollah. China signed valuable trade deals with Iran, bought Iranian oil in defiance of international sanctions, and joined Russia in conducting joint drills with the Iranian Navy. These actions provide a lifeline to Iran at a very dangerous time. The Ayatollah continues to fund and equip terrorists targeting American troops. His cronies are prolonging a civil war and a humanitarian crisis in Syria, and his regime is aggressively pursuing nuclear weapons. We absolutely cannot allow this to happen. I do not believe that re-entering the JCPOA will stop them. I look forward to hearing more about the administration's plan for ending the Ayatollah's quest for a nuclear weapon and how they intend to deal with the rest of the regime's destabilizing actions. Finally, to both you, General McKenzie and General Townsend, you continue to face tremendous challenges snuffing out hardened terrorists in both AORs, and I'm very concerned that we are backsliding on the progress we've made in combating terrorism. In Africa, the repositioning of U.S. and French forces further from terrorist hotspots is making it much harder for us to successfully conduct counterterrorism operations. In CENTCOM, President Biden's decision to unilaterally and unconditionally withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan has undermined our national security. As anticipated by nearly everyone except the President, the Taliban has overrun the government, and Afghanistan is reverting back to being a breeding ground for terrorists. The President assures us that this so-called over-the-horizon strategy will prevent that from happening. But this is completely devoid of reality. In the 6 months since the withdrawal, we have not been informed of a single successful over-the-horizon strike. I guess it's possible that al-Qaeda and ISIS-K have thrown down their arms and decided to live in peaceful coexistence with the West. But I fear what's more likely is that we no longer have a good handle on where the terrorists are or what they're doing. The truth is, without persistent ISR, reliable partners on the ground, and nearby facilities to launch assets, we lack the capability we need to conduct a successful strike. We know previously human intelligence, signal intelligence in theater, close to the adversary, is critically important. Now, I look forward to this afternoon's classified discussion on what capabilities we've lost and how we can help restore them. As to our posture shifts in the Indo-Pacific, we need to ensure other combatant commanders we have the capabilities they need to carry out their missions. We cannot allow for blind spots, especially in your two AORs. Before I wrap up, I'd like to thank both of you for your service, General Townsend, General McKenzie, incredible service to our nation. General McKenzie, I wish you the best in your retirement. Just make sure that you have your number available on speed dial. And again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Baker, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Congressman Whitman. Distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify, and I ask that my written statement be entered into the record. For the past year, the Biden administration has placed a priority on revitalizing and expanding the U.S. alliance and partnership architecture. In bringing together our partners' capabilities with our own, the Department is building an integrated deterrence framework that we believe creates advantages for ourselves and dilemmas for our adversaries. In the Middle East and Africa, the Department builds partnership through an approach that draws on all of our tools to include security cooperation, exercises, defense diplomacy, and force posture. The Department's priorities in the Middle East are to defend against Iranian-backed threats, to counter violent extremist organizations, and to deepen cooperation with our partners. We are committed to deterring and defending against threats posed by Iran and its proxies. The Department continuously evaluates the appropriate mix of forces to defend U.S. personnel and interests if necessary. In Iraq and Syria, the Department is committed to the enduring defeat of ISIS, supporting a broad whole-of-government strategy designed to address the underlying conditions that gave rise to ISIS. In Yemen, our policy objectives are to end the conflict, alleviate humanitarian suffering, and defeat the threat from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS Yemen. Separately, the department supports the UAE and Saudi Arabia in the defense of their territory and people from cross-border Houthi attacks. The department is committed to deepening cooperation and coordination between the United States, Israel, and partners in the Middle East and Africa. Recent normalization agreements have laid the groundwork for Israel's entrance into the U.S. Central Command, which will in turn, we believe, enhance cooperation in the security sphere. In Afghanistan, our military service members served honorably for 2 decades. Although we have withdrawn U.S. forces, the department continues to advance U.S. interests in Afghanistan. This includes monitoring indicators and warnings for counterterrorism threats against U.S. interests and the U.S. homeland. It also includes supporting the Department of State's efforts to facilitate the departure of American citizens, lawful permanent residents, and our Afghan allies, as well as efforts to alleviate the humanitarian crisis. We continue to support interagency partners in the care and resettlement of Afghan evacuees in the United States. In Central Asia, we are continuing to develop long-term security cooperation programs that are focused on bolstering regional capabilities to help counter a wide range of threats in the region and to the U.S. homeland. In our relationship with Pakistan, counterterrorism remains a focus as violent extremist organizations seek to target our shared interests and destabilize the region. Pakistan has participated robustly in counter-piracy efforts, for example, meant to ensure a free and open maritime transit. In Africa, the department remains focused on countering violent extremist organizations that pose a threat to the U.S. homeland and interests and addressing targeted strategic competition concerns. To those ends, the department is building partnerships that support conflict resolution, improving defense institutions, and attempting to strengthen democratic norms. DoD's training and exercises promote a respect for the law of armed conflict, for civilian oversight of the military, and for human rights. We employ a holistic approach working with our partners across the U.S. government to include state and USAID. We're reviewing all of our deployments to ensure that they are right-sized to balance our near-term challenges with our long-term modernization and readiness requirements. In the Horn of Africa, we remain committed to supporting our AMISOM partners. And in the East and in the Sahel, we're focused on interagency and multilateral efforts to stabilize the region and to improve our counter-VEO efforts. In North Africa, we support a common security objectives on the continent and in the southern Mediterranean. And in the maritime domain, alongside the Department of State, we are working with regional partners to secure the Atlantic from maritime and transnational threats. The department's approach to the Middle East and Africa is informed by threats to a free, stable, and open international order, including those posed by Russia and the PRC. Russia seeks to reshape security structures, exploiting governance vacuums and using private military companies and resource extraction to undermine U.S. interests. Beijing is establishing overseas infrastructure to project and sustain military power while expanding its influence and its access. As the department coordinates with partners to address our shared threats and their security needs, it will also seek to limit Russian and Chinese influence through sustained engagement, demonstrating the superiority of the United States as a partner of choice. With the support of the Congress, the department remains, we believe, well-positioned to support our allies and partners, to compete with Russia and the PRC, and to deter and defeat our adversaries across the Middle East and North Africa. In closing, I'd just like to echo, on behalf of the department, our thanks to both General McKenzie and General Townsend for their long service to our nation. And with that, I'll conclude and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Before turning to General Townsend, I had one programming note that I neglected to mention. We are going in reverse order of questioning today. We try to give the freshmen or junior members a chance to go first on some of our hearings. So we'll be starting with the least senior and working our way up today. Just make sure everyone's aware of that. General Townsend, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Smith, Congressman Whitman, distinguished members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to appear today, even as the eyes of the world are focused on Russia's lawless attack on the Ukraine and an unjust war which impacts Africa as well. For nearly 3 years, it's been the greatest privilege of my career to represent the dedicated members of U.S. Africa Command. Thank you for your steadfast support for them and for our mission. I'm here this morning with my battle buddy and Command Senior Enlisted Leader, Sergeant Major Richard Thresher, and colleagues, Dr. Sasha Baker and General Frank McKenzie. For General McKenzie and I, It's our final appearance before you. Our joint testimony highlights continued and pressing challenges and opportunities faced by our respective commands and our nation. Together with our interagency teammates, U.S. AFRICOM protects and advances U.S. interests, prevents strategic distraction, and preserves America's options, all in concert with our allies and partners. As AFRICOM's 5th commander, I've come to learn 5 truths about Africa. First, America cannot ignore Africa. Africa's challenges, opportunities, and security interests are inseparable from our own. Weak or poor governance, conflict, and climate change stress the stability of many African nations, which in turn will impact U.S. security and prosperity. Second, our competitors clearly see Africa's rich potential. China and Russia both seek to convert soft and hard power investments into political influence, strategic access, and military advantage. Both seek to bolster autocrats and change international norms in their favor. For China, Africa is their second continent. Across Africa, mercenaries from the Kremlin's Wagner Group offer their services for profit. Regime protection, resource exploitation, and horrific violence against Africans, just as we see in Ukraine today. Third, deadly terrorism has metastasized to Africa. Al-Qaeda's Al-Shabaab in East Africa and ISIS and Al-Qaeda groups in West Africa and elsewhere are among the world's fastest growing, wealthiest, and deadliest terrorist groups and remain grave and growing threats that aspire to kill Americans both there and in our homeland. Fourth, a battle between democracy and authoritarianism is raging across Africa. Despite a recent surge in democratic backsliding, our values, our democracy, our willingness to work with African partners create a huge demand for U.S. engagement and U.S. partnership. Fifth, in Africa, a few troops and a few bucks still go a long way. Modest and predictable resourcing yields outsized returns for U.S. and African security interests. As an economy of force and posture-limited theater, AFRICOM employs just 0.3% of DoD's operating budget and manpower. Modest investments today can yield a continent of partners tomorrow. We are most effective when we synchronize diplomacy, development, and defense. So we are grateful for your continued leadership and backing to resource our interagency partners at the State Department, USAID, and the intel community. Thanks to the authorities and resources you provide and your continued interest and support in the capabilities that AFRICOM requires to accomplish our mission. In summary, U.S. AFRICOM remains cheap insurance for America's security. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. General McKenzie.
Chairman Smith, Representative Whitman, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, it's a pleasure to be here today beside the Honorable Sasha Baker and General Steve Townsend, and in the company of my senior enlisted leader, Fleet Master Chief Jamie Hurdell. I want to thank you for allowing me this opportunity to testify for the final time regarding U.S. Central Command's posture in an area of responsibility that encompasses 21 nations, 600 million people, and lies at the strategic nexus of the world's most important corridors of trade. Much has transpired since I last delivered my annual posture testimony, most notably the conclusion of our military campaign in Afghanistan, and of course Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine. America's interests in the central region and the challenges we confront there have proven remarkably resilient. CENTCOM's mission to direct and enable military operations and activities with allies and partners to increase regional stability in support of enduring U.S. interests is essentially unchanged from the day of the command's founding. The primary threats to that security and stability are also very familiar even today. CENTCOM was established nearly 40 years ago to counter the malign influence of a revolutionary regime that had seized power in Tehran and to compete with a great power that had, in spite of international condemnation, invaded the sovereign state of Afghanistan and imposed a puppet regime. Today, Iran is no less of a threat to American interests or the stability of the region than it was in 1979. To the contrary, the threat posed by Iran is graver than ever. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, moreover, has violently demonstrated its willful disregard for international norms, just as we have seen through Russia's actions in Syria and elsewhere, in fact, anywhere it sees an opportunity to diminish confidence in America's leadership. In a more measured fashion, China is also vying for increased influence at American expense in a region it depends upon for over 40% of its fossil fuels. Meanwhile, violent extremist organizations, or VEOs, in the CENTCOM area continue to pose a credible threat to the homeland. In sum, the central region remains today a vital and volatile arena for strategic competition and the decisive theater in the campaign against VEOs. The campaign to defeat the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria has entered a new phase. As of 1 January of this year, Iraq has assumed sole responsibility for counter-ISIS combat operations on its own soil. In Syria, CENTCOM and its partners are degrading ISIS's ability to regenerate by improving the security of facilities for detained ISIS fighters, as well as for the displaced persons camps where their families and others reside. More than half of this population comes from other countries, and addressing the threat of ISIS in northeast Syria ultimately will require those countries to reclaim and repatriate whatever citizens of theirs remain in these prisons and camps, ending one of the world's worst humanitarian crises and depriving ISIS of what currently is fertile soil for indoctrination and spreading terror. In Afghanistan, our campaign against al-Qaeda and ISIS-Khorasan has also entered a new phase. We are now conducting this campaign from bases over the horizon. As I've said before, this is difficult, but it is not impossible. I should add today that we will be able to do so only so long as CENTCOM has the requisite resources to find, fix, and finish threats to the homeland before those threats develop the capability to conduct external operations. I'm talking specifically about ISR assets and strike platforms. CENTCOM has the tools it needs to perform this mission, but the margins are thin and the risk will increase should resources diminish. In the Middle East, Iran continues to pose the greatest threat to U.S. interests and the security of the region as a whole. Through its proxies and clients, Iran has fomented conflict in an arc tracing from Yemen through the Arabian Peninsula, across Iraq and Syria into Lebanon, and to the very borders of Israel. Saudi Arabia endures regular attacks from the Houthis, who wield some of the most advanced unmanned aerial systems and cruise missiles in the region, all courtesy of the Iranians. Recently, the Houthis expanded these attacks to include urban centers and bases with U.S. forces in the United Arab Emirates. Tehran also enables its aligned militias in Iraq and Syria to carry on a persistent, low-level campaign of indirect fire and UAS attacks against U.S. and coalition forces, hoping to drive us from the region. Iran's ballistic missile forces constitute an exigent threat to the security of every state in the region, among them our most important and enduring partners. They continue to look to the United States for assurance that we, the historic partner of choice in the region, will remain a reliable one. China and Russia are also watching closely for any sign that America's commitment to the collective security of the region is wavering, and they are poised to capitalize on whatever opportunities emerge. In closing, let me thank you again for this opportunity to testify. I'd also like to thank the soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, Coast Guardsmen, and Guardians who have served and sacrificed in the CENTCOM AOR. It has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as their commander. Thank you.
Thank you. Just two quick questions. General Townsend, could you walk us through what you think China is doing in Africa? When I had met with you, you gave a pretty good brief, and I know some of it would have to do in the classified session later. But what are they doing in Africa? How does it threaten us, and what are we doing to address it?
Thanks for the question, Chairman. There's should be some handouts at your places there that you can refer to. There's one on China there that depicts what I'll just kind of briefly talk to. They compete with us in Africa. First of all, China has made a deliberate decision to compete with America in Africa and win that competition. They compete primarily through economic means and diplomatic means. And you can see that there with their Belt and Road Initiative. They are investing everywhere across the continent. We don't actually have to meet that competition in every location head on. We have to pick and choose where we're going to do that. And there are countries where it's important that we do. In the military sphere, you heard in the chairman's opening remarks there that they have their one overseas base in Djibouti. The primary thing that concerns me with China's military competition in Africa is that they are actively seeking a military base on the Atlantic coast of Africa. And for a variety of reasons that I will go to in closed session, that would be bad for America's security. We, as a first priority, we need to deter a Chinese base in the Atlantic coast of Africa.
Thank you. And General McKenzie, on just a quick specific question on Yemen. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen continues to be great. The fight has gone back and forth there. I know we have, our envoys there have tried to get to a peace agreement, but are unable to do that. But in terms of getting food, humanitarian assistance, basic supplies into Yemen, we continually hear about, the blockade of Yemen, that Saudi Arabia is leading this effort, blocking the ability of these supplies to get in. Is there more that we could do to free up the ability to get supplies, the basic supplies of, food, medical supplies, humanitarian aid into Yemen? And what's really going on in terms of the effort to blockade that by Saudi Arabia or by anybody else?
Chairman, you're correct. It is very difficult to get humanitarian aid into Yemen. It's further compounded by the fact that there are distribution problems that the Houthis are associated with once that aid gets in. I would agree that there is more that we could do with our friends in the region to allow more humanitarian aid to enter Yemen, and I would support that action. However, I think the larger problem is the distribution of the aid once it enters Yemen and actually gets out to the people that need it. The UN Special Representative is working that very hard, but that remains, I think, the most significant problem when it comes to distribution of aid to the many hundreds of thousands of people who experience food insecurity in Yemen.
But before it gets in, the Saudis in particular are searching ships, blocking ships from getting in because they're afraid that arms are being shipped in.
Sure, they are, and they have also allowed aid ships to enter. It's not a perfect solution. It is not a perfect solution, and I acknowledge that.
Yeah. Well, that's something I'd like to continue to work with you on because, as you know, the humanitarian crisis there is extreme. And with that, I will yield to Mr. Whitman for his question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank our witnesses. I want to follow up on what the chairman talked about. It's concerning to me not just the dynamic that's happening between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, but the support that Iran is providing to Yemen. That, to me, allows them to do the things that they're doing that are very, very disruptive in that area. As we know, they've looted UN food convoys. They've laid over 1 million mines in civilian areas. They've recruited thousands of child soldiers and have taken over the closed U.S. embassy. They're holding at least 11 former U.S. embassy staffers hostage, and they've stepped up cross-border attacks by drones and missiles against the UAE that have actually targeted and killed civilians in the UAE. And as the chairman pointed out, they've completely rebuffed efforts by the current administration to enter into any kind of talks to resolve these particular issues. General McKenzie, I want to go to you first and ask, what are your thoughts about what we can do in interrupting the relationship between Iran and the Houthis, which allow them, unfortunately, to continue to keep this unsettled state in Yemen, and that, in turn, antagonizes the Saudis, and this just continues to escalate? Can you give us your perspective on that?
Sir, I can. And I'd like to note at the beginning that while the supply of humanitarian aid to Yemen has been imperfect and not consistent, throughout the long history of this crisis, Iran has never imported a single bag of rice or any other foodstuff into Yemen. Yeah. In fact, the only material they brought into Yemen is stuff designed to kill people. Yeah. So we should just remember that when we talk about the people here. Sir, I believe there's an opportunity for a negotiated settlement here. I believe that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and I believe UAE are open to that solution. I believe that the Houthis have an opportunity should they choose to negotiate, but under prompting from their Iranian masters, they have instead chosen to double down. They continue their attacks into Saudi Arabia. As you noted, they have ramped up attacks into UAE in a very disturbing new phase of operations. But I think there is an opportunity here under the UN, under the United Nations, to get to a truce, and a truce would be the best of possible worlds, where we would be able to begin to open Hodeidah, get foodstuffs into Hodeidah, and distribute it under the auspices of someone other than the Houthis and their ability to interfere with it.
Can enough pressure be put on Iran and Saudi Arabia to kind of force the Houthis to the table and say, listen, you got to resolve this?
I don't believe it's in Iran's interest to end the war in Yemen. I think it's a fairly low-cost war for them. As you noted, it embarrasses Saudi Arabia, it embarrasses UAE, and I think they're actually not motivated to do that right now. I think it is certainly in the Houthis' best interest to cut a deal. So the ball's sort of in their court. They have some opportunities. They need to seize those opportunities because, frankly, sir, I don't think those opportunities are going to be there forever.
Yeah, thanks. Let me ask you briefly, too, about the growing threat from ISIS-K in Afghanistan. As we had heard before, by complete withdrawal of forces there, we knew that the risks were going to increase. Obviously, they have. The concern is that that risk is going to extend beyond the borders of Afghanistan, that they'll have an opportunity or a capability to pursue attacks outside of Afghanistan. That is incredibly troubling. Also, our ability to do significant CT operations in Afghanistan, the issues of what we used to have as far as human intelligence, signal intelligence, greatly degraded now. The over-the-horizon capability is just not something that's realistic in relation to the threat that we face. I wanted to get your best military judgment regarding the adequacy of the current force structure in CENTCOM following our departure from Afghanistan. What do we have in place? Is it enough with this over-the-horizon capability to really keep a handle and keep ISIS-K from growing to a point where it can perpetrate attacks outside the border there? And what are the risks with our current force structure? What are the risks that are there before us today, and how do you think those risks will continue to grow?
Sir, in the closed session a little later this afternoon, I'm going to exhaustively drill down into our force posture and all the disciplines of intelligence that we're applying in Afghanistan and give you very detailed and specific, granular answers to those questions, but I'd prefer to do that in the closed session. I will say that we are very concerned about the potential for ISIS-K growth in Afghanistan, and we assess that they do retain a desire to attack us in our homeland here in the United States, and absent effective pressure, that threat will only grow and metastasize over time.
Okay, very good. That's one what I'll get to, is that you continue to see it growing then in the years to come unless something significant's done in the meantime.
Sir, and I'll talk about that in great detail a little bit later today.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Whitman. In accordance with the chairman's extraordinary procedure today, the chair recognizes Mr. Panetta from California.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. Just wish I would have had a little more insight as to the order, but thank you very much. That being said, gentlemen, doctor, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate your time, appreciate your testimony. I'm going to focus it down to West Africa, obviously, and more particular in Mali especially. We know that the French came in back in 2013, Operation Barkhane. They had U.S. support. Unfortunately, now the French are leaving. Unfortunately, now there is a void. I don't have confidence in the 15,000 blue hats that are there on the ground to fill that void. I'm very skeptical of the Malian government to actually contract with the Wagner Group as well to do that. I know that we provided support in Operation Barkhane, and maybe this is a conversation we can have later this afternoon. But my question to you is, one, why are the French leaving? Two, who do you see filling that void? Three, why did they contract with the Wagner Group? And if you can go into that a little bit. And then my last question is, does China have a strategy? You have this nice map here that shows their involvement in Africa. Does China have a strategy to deal with the violent extremism in Africa?
Thanks, Congressman. First, the French aren't leaving. They are repositioning West Africa. They are leaving, as you pointed out,
They're
in Mali.
coming to Niger, correct?
That's their plan is to go to Niger and Cote d'Ivoire and maybe a few other places. So they are repositioning their forces. You asked the question, why are they leaving? So in our interactions with the French, they had come to the realization that it was time to reset their campaign there and maybe gain new efficiencies. And so they had already made a decision, which the French government had announced, that they were going to reposition, reposture in West Africa. Then we had successive coups in Mali,
Right.
and Mali, as you know, has invited in Wagner. I think they've invited in, that gets to your second question, why have they invited Wagner in? They've invited Wagner in because they believe that Wagner will replace the French and do a better job. When I learned of this, I traveled to Mali and I met with the president there, the junta president there, and I explained that I thought it was a bad idea to invite Wagner in because we've seen them, I have seen them in Syria, and I've seen them in other places in Africa, and Wagner obeys no rules. They won't follow the direction of the government. They won't partner more effectively. I think they will only bring bad
Was
things.
he listening? Will he listen?
He told me that it wasn't Wagner, that they were dealing with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Except I think President Putin later said there are no Russian military in Mali. There are private military companies there, Wagner. So I think that only bad will come from that. I think there may be some initial gains. We're seeing Wagner deploy and build their base camps. They haven't really started significant operations yet. I think they've already suffered some casualties. I think
Casualties from violent extremism?
yes. I think that the only bad's going to come from their deployment there. You ask about China. We don't see China having a counter-violent extremist role. They are in Mali, though. They're there as part of, they have a substantial force there as part of MINUSMA, the UN mission there. But we don't see them we see them doing a little bit of counterterrorism training on the continent, but we do not see them conducting any counter-VEO operations.
And a lot of our role then will be from Niger. Is that correct in regards to any sort of what we do?
We currently have forces in Niger, and I'm working with the Department of Defense on a strategy for West Africa that will take into account the French reposturing, that will take into account the malign actors like Wagner in the region.
And it sounds like you don't necessarily believe this Malayan official who you spoke to in regards to that it was a Russian, organized Russian group. You believe it's the Wagner group who's in there now.
It's the Wagner group supported by the Ministry of Defense and the Kremlin. The Russian Air Force flew them in.
Thank you. Once again, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. I was closely watching the portraits of the past chairman. There was no disturbance of the universe, so nice job. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just thought this was a gift that you were giving an Irishman on St. Patrick's Day, so I appreciate that. Thank you all for your service, and thanks for being here today. General McKenzie, I was a bit dumbfounded about a week and a half ago. I read an article, a report in the Wall Street Journal that the UAE's Sheikh and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia would not take a call from the President of the United States. I found that alarming. I wanted to just hear what your thoughts on that.
Well, relationships at that level would probably be better with Ms. Baker or the Department of State than me. I can tell you that at my level, I have no trouble talking to the chiefs of defense of each of those two countries, and I talk to them frequently.
Okay. Ms. Baker, if you'd like to comment, thank you.
Congressman, thank you. I can't speak to the specifics of the President's phone calls. What I can tell you is from a defense perspective, as General McKenzie said, we have long and enduring strategic partnerships with both Saudi Arabia and UAE. Those have existed for any number of years.
I know, that's
we
why
are
I
fully
find it
committed
so
to them.
alarming and shocking that they weren't taken. I thought they were allies of ours in the region, and not to take the President of the United States phone call, to me, it spoke volumes about the deteriorating relationship.
Again, I can't speak to the President's phone calls. I can tell you that, as General McKenzie said, we pick up the phone and we talk with these folks every day, and we have a very close and enduring partnership from a defense perspective.
General McKenzie, in Syria, I would love to, if you could just touch on the influences that Turkey, Russia, and Iran have. It seems to be an absolute mess, you know, from everything we read, and then the maps didn't help too much either. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So in Syria, Iran uses Syria principally as a land bridge to move advanced conventional weapons into Lebanon to be employed against Israel as a possibility. They're also interested in operating against our forces that are there in Syria. As in Yemen, Iran, generally speaking, has no positive objective in Syria. Rather, their goals are almost wholly negative.
Just disruption.
It is disruption, but also they view it, again, we shouldn't understate the importance of that corridor that allows them to move weapons to position against what they consider their greatest foe and the nation they've sworn to destroy, Israel. Russia is obviously has a client state in Syria. They came in and right after the beginning of the Civil War. They've been there for quite a while. It allows them to do several things by being in there. First of all, it is opportunistic. I don't see a long-term strategy in the Russian action. They've got an air base in western Syria. They've got a naval base in the eastern Mediterranean, which they had during the Cold War, I might add, so it's not a new thing necessarily. It also gives them the opportunity to attempt a posture on the global stage and to throw sand in our gearbox. Again, it's an act of opportunism that is, that we see as typical of a lot of Russian activity. The Turks have genuine national security concerns.
Is it the Kurds mainly? Are they concerned about the Kurds more than anything else?
The Turks are, yes.
Yeah.
We would argue that there are different elements within the Kurds, and we disagree with Turkey on that. On all the Kurds being devoted to attacking Turkey, but they do have legitimate security concerns. We also, as you know, partner heavily with the Syrian Democratic Forces and other Syrian Kurdish elements to actually conduct the fight against ISIS. So there's a genuine dispute there between us and our NATO partners over that. But when all is said and done, we do recognize they have legitimate security concerns.
Thank you, General. General Townsend, I was noticing in the foreign aid, we crushed the Chinese, 11 billion to about 2.5, but in economic trade, they're almost quadruple ours in Africa. What I wanted to ask you is, who's China the chummiest with? Whose relationships are the best as far as the nation states they have in relationships they have in Africa? And what worries you most about that theater?
Well, Congressman, thanks. I don't think anybody's asked me who China's chummiest with in Africa before, so I don't think I've contemplated that. They have pretty good relations with a lot of the countries on the continent. Where the relations are strained is in their earlier in economic investments, where they have lured African countries into what we call debt trap diplomacy. And there are a number of those countries where a large percentage of foreign debt is held by China, and China has extended leases on critical infrastructure like ports and airports. The thing I think I'm most worried about is this military base on the Atlantic coast. And where they have the most traction for that today is in Equatorial Guinea. Yeah. They've laid markers down up and down the coastline, but the place where they've actually made progress toward this is Equatorial Guinea. And we have had a recent interagency delegation travel there to discuss that with the government there.
Well, it concerns me because it's like almost an end around to the Monroe Doctrine in some ways to have a Chinese base.
Thank
on
you.
the Atlantic.
Gentleman's time has expired. The
Thank
chair
you,
now
Chair.
recognizes Congresswoman Luria.
Well, thank you. And General McKenzie, I'd like to start with a quote that you made. You said the proximate causes for the establishment of CENTCOM nearly 40 years ago was Iran, and today Iran is no less of a threat to American interest or the stability of the region than it was in 1979. To the contrary, the threat posed by Iran is graver than ever. So I'd like to ask you, from a perspective of CENTCOM, how is the United States and our allies prepared to respond to this threat from Iran?
So the actual operational expression of the Iranian threat is in the vast improvements in their ballistic missile, their land attack cruise missile, and their small unmanned aerial vehicle platforms, which over the last 5 to 7 years have dramatically increased both in number and in accuracy and ability to fly in relatively undetected ways. All of that directly threatens the immediate partners.
So the 5 to 7 years, what year did we enter into the JCPOA? It's about that time frame?
About that time frame,
So I just wanted to shift, and maybe we can have a more thorough conversation on the first part of the question. But so if the United States returns to the JCPOA, what impact do you foresee that having on Iran's regional activities? What impact on the flow of additional resources to the Houthis, to Hezbollah, to Hamas, and their actions in the region against the United States, Israel, and our allies?
So I will note, the principal foreign policy objective we have vis-a-vis Iran is for them not to possess a nuclear weapon. So a JCPOA would presumably give that assurance.
The current agreement has allowed them to have additional resources to fund these proxy organizations.
So I believe that what they do with their ballistic missiles, their proxies and other things are not necessarily coupled directly to the JCPOA. But I will acknowledge that there could be second-order effects of that. I do not know what the terms of the pending JCPOA will be. I just don't have that information.
So perhaps I'll turn to Ms. Baker, and I really don't think it's a disputed fact by the fact that we've eased pressure, we've lifted sanctions. Iran has more resources, and those resources are flowing to these proxy groups and terrorist organizations throughout the region. So if a nuclear deal is reached with Iran, I think that it's likely that Tehran will use a significant part of those associated sanctions reliefs to attack Israel and support these terrorist proxies. Are we open to supplying Israel with additional security assistance and other support in light of this potential situation?
Congresswoman, our commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. We consult with them on a near daily basis.
Are they
and
at the table in the negotiations for the JCPOA right now?
Congresswoman, the department, of course, does not have the lead on those negotiations, but my understanding is the Israelis are not at the table. We do consult with them regularly, and we are in regular conversations about how we can better bolster their security in the region.
So if we consult with them regularly, have they expressed concerns over the pending reentry into the Iran deal?
I think this is a subject of active conversation, and I don't know that there's a unified opinion on that. That being said, we are committed to their security. We are committed to giving them the equipment, the capabilities that they need, the QME that we've committed to.
Okay, so I'll shift back to General McKenzie, and I wanted to ask, why hasn't there been a more forceful U.S. response to Iran's aggression against our allies and our troops in the region? For example, we just saw this strike this weekend towards Erbil in the vicinity of the U.S. consulate, and Iran directly took responsibility for that strike.
Ma'am, I'd like to talk about that in the closed session if I could, and I'll be prepared to go into great detail. I would tell you that I think our response has been measured, balanced. After the strike on UAE by the Houthis, we deployed a 5th-generation fighter squadron to Al Dhafra Air Force Base. I sent a ballistic missile-capable destroyer to UAE's waters, and we've done a variety of other things to enhance their protection. So sometimes it doesn't require an immediate kinetic response in order to show a measured response that assures our partners and allies.
So has our current policy of not having a 1.0 continuous carrier presence in the Gulf, have you seen any change in Iran's activities due to that? And do you think a carrier in the Gulf is essential for a deterrent? And lastly, balancing that versus the need for that asset within the 7th Fleet AOR or for PACOM. Can you?
So as I think about deterring Iran, I don't think in terms of individual platforms. I think in terms of the holistic capabilities of the joint force, land-based air, carrier-based air, and so one's up, one's down. We have other uses for those carriers. They can't be everywhere, but we do innovative things. We bring bomber task forces in from the United States. There are a variety of things I can display to ensure the Iranians know that we have the capability to defend ourselves and to punish them if they continue their malign activities.
Right. So in your assessment, these shore-based squadrons are providing essentially you as the combatant commander the same equivalent capability as a deterrent?
Yes, and other capabilities as well beyond that.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. McClain is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, perhaps I didn't hear that correctly, so I'll apologize in advance. Did I hear you say that Israel doesn't have an opinion or a position on the JCPOA?
No, ma'am. I believe that they have expressed concerns.
And they want us to go back in or not go back in? What is their opinion?
Congresswoman, I think it's a complex situation. I'm not sure that there is a unified point of view.
That's interesting because when I was in Israel, it was clearly unified. So I'm just.
We've heard Israel's concerns about the JCPOA loud and clear. I want to acknowledge.
I just want to
that.
make sure I understood that because I didn't catch that.
What we've committed to in response is to the ongoing conversation we have about ensuring Israel's QME, its security. That was the case before the JCPOA. It's the case during when we were in the JCPOA, and it will continue.
But to be clear, they do have a response. They do have an opinion. They do have a position, and we are clearly aware of what that position is.
Congresswoman, that's my understanding, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to clear that up. Thank you all for being here. General McKenzie, the DoD Inspector General in a recent report stated that Iran and Iran-aligned militias continue to have strong ties to some elements of Iraq's traditional security forces, especially pointing out that Iraq's federal police under the Ministry of Interior. My question is this, does the department or any agency of the U.S. government to continue to provide assistance for Iraq's federal police and Ministry of the Interior? Do we provide funds to them?
Congresswoman, I'll have to take that one for the record. I'll come back with a precise answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, Just this weekend, Iran directly launched missiles in the vicinity of our consulate, right, in Erbil, Kurdistan. I'm trying to understand this and come to grips with this, is how can we justify using taxpayer dollars to go to a police force that supports that, or dollars to support that?
I'll go into more detail in the closed session, but I can tell you that they were not targeting us with those strikes.
I think I want to believe you. I think the American people want to believe you. I'm just not much for coincidences. It's scary when you're on the outside looking in. So I look forward to the briefing to make us feel a little bit better about that.
Certainly.
And then my second question is, are you familiar, obviously, with the Badr Corps?
I am.
Okay. My question is, do you believe that that organization is best described as a terrorist organization?
It has. Let me come back to you on that. If you want to, let me put it better. I prefer to answer that in the closed session if I can, and I'll be prepared to do that.
With that, I yield back.
Ms. Slotkin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks. Thanks for you all being here and having served, I think, with all three of you in different capacities. Really appreciate your service and all the work that you've done for the country over many, many years. I just want to continue the conversation on Iran and General McKenzie. You know, I was reading through your testimony, and there's a lot of discussion about Iran's nefarious activities in the Middle East and their ballistic missile program. Can you give us as much as possible, just for the American public to understand the stakes of their nuclear program, how close they are to turning fissile material into nuclear, you know, and weapons-grade material, and your assessment of the threat, where it falls vis-a-vis the other threats coming from Iran?
Thank you. It's good to see you again, ma'am. I would note, first of all, I think the Iranians are close. I don't think that they've made a decision to go forward. I think they actually, my assessment is, they want the sanctions relief that's already been discussed here. And so I think the best solution would be to get an agreement where they're not going to pursue a nuclear weapon. So I'll say that as number one. What really concerns me much more on a day-to-day basis are their ballistic missiles, their cruise missiles, and their land attack cruise missiles, which they have invested in heavily at great cost to their population over the past several years. Those capabilities directly threaten their neighbors today. And we saw an example of that in the attack on Iraq over the weekend, their ability to fire very accurate missiles into a neighboring country, something they've done before, including the attack on Al-Assad Air Base in January of 2020. Those capabilities concern me, and I believe they concern our neighbors and friends in the region as well. And that's actually one of the opportunities I'll talk a little bit more in the closed session about is we have an opportunity to work on integrated air and missile defense. That's the great opportunity in U.S. Central Command right now, because that will address a cogent, imminent threat to all of our neighbors in the region, and it's a tremendous opportunity. What that doesn't do is address the proxies, and their proxy forces are very active. You know, principally, we look at Iraq and in Syria, but they're obviously active in Yemen and in other places, both in and out of the region. And that's another significant element that we work with our partners against.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as someone who used to work on Iraq and work in Iraq, Iran's terrorist activities were an everyday fact of life, frankly, if you were over there. But I guess the question I have is, from the chairman on down, the best military advice on a deal that would focus just on the nuclear parts of the Iranian threat. We're going to be asked in some form or fashion to weigh in on this. There's, I think, a lot of briefing and a lot of work that's still going to go on to bring people up to speed. But as I understand it, the deal, like the last deal, doesn't include the ballistic missile program and the terrorism. What was the best military advice from the chairman on closing such a deal?
I would defer to the chairman on that deal, on that military advice. I would note the last deal did not include those ancillary elements that you talked about,
right?
And that's concerning.
But your best military advice at your level, since this is your AOR, you support a deal that would just be focused on the nuclear parts of the threat?
I support Iran not having a nuclear weapon, and I would support the most effective way to get there. That will not solve all our problems, but it would solve one problem. There are other areas that we need to work in, and I know that we've expressed interest in broadening the agreement. And my understanding is Iran has resisted that. But I think we do need to get to a broader agreement. But our number one priority is for them not to have a nuclear weapon.
Appreciate that. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Bice is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the witnesses being here this morning. General McKenzie, has there been an impact to your AOR since the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And if so, can you describe the movement of the fighters potentially from Syria or elsewhere from the AOR into Ukraine?
So, we watch the Russians closely across the region. They have not done much force balancing as a result of the Ukraine operation. I can talk a little bit more about that in the closed session. Not much, really none significant. We have not seen a flow of fighters, and I can give you some precise numbers in the closed session, but we just haven't seen much of that yet out of Syria. I know there's a lot of discussion of that. It's just not evident to us, and we look at that pretty closely. That could change, but that's sort of what we see right now.
I want to take a step back. We were discussing in previous lines of questioning the Taliban and what's happened in Afghanistan. During the NDAA markup, I offered an amendment which required the DoD to report to Congress the security impacts of the release of the prisoners from Bagram Air Base. Can you share some of the security impacts that you've seen from CENTCOM AOR as a result of the prisoners' releases?
Sure. The release of the prisoners from Bagram, Parwan, and Policharki, which the Taliban overran on or about the 13th through the 15th of August, first of all, injected about 1,000 ISIS fighters back into the battle space of Afghanistan, and that rejuvenated ISIS-K, and I believe the Taliban are going to grow to reject that or to regret the decision to release those prisoners. It also released thousands of Taliban fighters and others who returned to the Taliban. But I think that their action, short-sighted, actually has had a profoundly negative effect on conditions inside Afghanistan. I believe ultimately, unless we're able to keep effective CT pressure on ISIS in particular, they will have the opportunity to grow and seek to strike us here in the homeland.
And you mentioned that earlier. Last question. It is widely known that large swaths of the telecom infrastructure throughout the continent of Africa are run on Chinese-produced hardware, including Huawei and ZTE. I've long been concerned with the network security threats from compromised Chinese-produced hardware. Can you talk about your level of concern with these types of threats from AFRICOM AOR?
Yes, so part of that extensive Chinese investment on the African continent is telecommunications, as you just mentioned. Huawei is endemic across the continent. They're building smart cities, safe cities, which are going to make connect everything in those cities, and it will report back to Beijing. Usually, it reports back to Beijing before it reports to the host nation's capital. So that's a fairly significant threat that I don't think we truly understand the implications of, and we won't till sometime in the future.
Do you think our allies are aware of that?
Yes, I believe that they are, but at the same time, they're wanting to pull their countries into the modern world, and so China is offering very lucrative technologies that they probably wouldn't be able to access otherwise. And so I think they're going into it mostly with eyes open.
Do you think there's any effective response that the U.S. could have to this type of coercion, if you will?
I think probably, and I'll defer to Ms. Baker, but I think probably having an economical alternative, right? Some competitive alternatives on the economic side in the free market is probably the best alternative.
I love the word free market, General. Are we too far down the path, though, with the amount of equipment that's been installed in Africa to really impact in a positive way the continent?
No, I don't believe that we are.
Okay.
In the countries and the safe cities that are already being established, yes, but elsewhere, I don't believe that we are.
Ms. Baker?
Congressman, if I could just add to that, I think our strategy as it relates to the telecommunications infrastructure and the China challenge is twofold. The first, as General Townsend said, is we are trying to make sure that partners and allies in the region, not only in AFRICOM, but globally, have the information that we see about the threat that this poses to their infrastructure and the potential vulnerabilities that it will, introduce into their system. So that's part one, is sort of an educational aspect. We're also, and this is not a Department of Defense lead, but as an administration, looking at technological solutions that would allow some of these countries to get after that telecommunications capability that they're so desperate to get, but in a way that's safer.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Ms. Murphy is recognized for 5 minutes.